6 months before. Many things happens time. Seen millions, and still questions, confusions were completed. As offer point between MANA, Medical Association of America, and the Christian Youth CY now we are to present. I would like to present to you my very esteemed panelists. With me is Dr. Rafat Fahim. He holds a PhD in biochemistry. He's a vaccinologist for the past 35 years, had very high and large experience in research, development, manufacturing, quality, regulatory, and business, both at Sanofi Pasteur and at Nabi Biopharmaceuticals. Dr. Fahim developed several popular and widely used vaccines, both for pediatrics and adults use, like the Quadracell, the Pentacell, and Pediacell, as well as for adults, the Adacell. Almost any one of us who is above the age of 24 years probably received as a child or as an adult one of the vaccines. Dr. Fahim started his research as a scientist and with Sanofi Pasteur and was the senior vice president of late stage development and manufacturing operations by the time he left Sanofi Pasteur. He then joined Nabi Biopharmaceuticals, which is a US-based vaccine company, and he was the Nabi's president and chief executive and a chief financial officer. After retirement, Dr. Fahim started his own counseling company and is currently consulting for the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, the CEPI, and the Gates Foundation. He is advising many companies developing the COVID-19 vaccine regarding the development, manufacturing, quality, and regulatory. I welcome Dr. Rafat Fahim. I'm also honored to present one of our esteemed doctors in Simana, Dr. Sharif Mossad. He's an MD and fellow of the American College of Physicians. He's a professor of medicine and infectious disease specialist at Cleveland Clinic, Lerner College of Medicine of Case Western Reserve University. So our plan is each one of us will be presenting for 5 to 7 minutes, some scientific or epidemiological studies. Then we will be receiving, and I'll be moderating to ask the two professors your questions. Please feel free to send your questions while we are live. So this time we called our forum, Our Shot to Defeat COVID. And this is Dr. Rafat Fahim, you'll be meeting shortly, and Dr. Mossad, who you will be speaking next. This graph shows the daily new confirmed COVID-19 cases per million of people, and it shows several countries. As you can see, the United Kingdom seems to be rising to their 4th wave. United States coming down from that wave. Canada and Australia seem to be somewhere hovering here, and Egypt is here. These are the daily new cases up to earlier this week, and you can see there are at least 3 waves so far that we know of. These are the daily death. Close to about a year and a half ago. These are the exact numbers for USA, Egypt, Canada, and Australia. And unfortunately, the numbers are all in the plus sign, meaning we did not yet defeat this virus. I'll pick on some countries. Of course, the United States. Thankfully, we did not have a major rise in this wave. And our numbers in the daily cases, as you can see on October 17, was around 50,000 across the whole country. Of course, that's far better than the 300,000 that we had in January this year. Canada is also having their third wave, although it seems to be coming down, and the numbers are in the 3,000s. Australia, unfortunately, while they did so great, and they're one of the most exemplary countries for many months throughout the pandemic, unfortunately, since August, their numbers have rose so much to the extent this is one of the highest levels of rises across the world. And they have a major lockdown for several weeks in order to contain that rise. To dig deeper in Australia, this is the curve. As you can see, they did not have a major wave all through the past year compared to the rest of the world. But unfortunately, since July, August, they have a major wave that's really affecting them badly. Again, this is the number of cases per 100,000 population in Australia based on the region. And as you can see, each one, New South Wales and Victoria are, of course, the commonest. Egypt looks like going into the fourth wave, if anyone can imagine that's a fourth. But between the second and third, they did not have much relief. Unfortunately, the numbers in Egypt start to rise again. And because of Australia and Egypt, we are really dedicating this forum today. From Johns Hopkins database, you can see across the board, this is one of the major pandemics, although not the highest in our last 100 years. Again, you can see the weekly cases, the weekly death, and the doses administered. And you can see that we cannot say that we were able to control this virus yet. You will hear a lot about symptoms and about presentations and about diseases and how to combat it. In the Western countries and also in Egypt, unfortunately, the flu season will have a major overlap with COVID-19. And unfortunately, there may be symptoms that may not be distinguished between both. Few words about the numbers in vaccinations until Dr. Fahim speaks more about it. Close to 50% of the world now has at least one COVID-19 vaccine. 6.7 billion doses have been administered. Unfortunately, the low-income countries have less than 3% with one dose, which unfortunately is a major, major setback in this pandemic. If you look at the share of people vaccinated against COVID-19 as of October 18 this year, the best country in the world is Emirates, followed by Canada, 78%, France, 75%, United Kingdom, 72%, Australia, 71%, United States, 65%, across the board, 48%, Philippines, 25%, Egypt, 13%, Namibia, 11%, and Ethiopia, less than 3%. Across the board in US, the COVID-19 vaccine doses, the million vaccinated, Texas, 33 million vaccinated, Florida, 27 million, New York State, 27 million, and so on. As you can see, the numbers go dwindling less and less. I want to end by these two slides. I looked up at the comparison of the 20th century annual morbidity and mortality from vaccine preventable diseases. I am putting this slide as a prelude to what you will hear from Dr. Fahim, because there is a lot of fear still, even though billions of people were vaccinated. Look how we don't see any more smallpox. Smallpox, there is 0 cases. Diphtheria, 0 cases. Pertussis still, we are only 91% decrease. Tetanus, we are 94% with the vaccine decrease. There is no polio in the world today, thanks to the vaccine. Measles, we are over 99% control of measles. Mumps, we are over 96% control of measles, of mumps. Rubella, 99%. And even the influenza, 99%. Unfortunately, there are lots of groups who are anti-vaxxers, and really they're in a sort of Kaiser Family Foundation poll, they found in a sample of anti-vaxxers these numbers. Close to 70% say the long-term effects of vaccines are unknown. 60% worry about serious side effects. 55% believe the vaccines are not as safe as they are said to be. And 31% think they might get COVID-19 from the vaccine itself. Now I would like to ask Dr. Fahim to take over. As I remind you again, Dr. Rafat Fahim holds a PhD in biochemistry, and he is a vaccinologist for the last 35 years. He himself was in charge of production and design of several vaccines, and he's currently in the business of doing quality assurance of many of the vaccines that you hear of. Dr. Fahim, thank you very much. We are honored to have you. You can share your slides. You are muted, please.
Okay. I think I need to get up. Give me a second, please. Okay. Let's stop sharing. Okay. Somehow it doesn't want to move, but give me 1 second. I should be able to get it going. Okay. Thank you for your patience. So thank you very much again, and hello everyone. I will be speaking about the vaccines and where we are, and answer some of the common questions that I get frequently during my daily routine with vaccines. So just a reminder, for way of background, this is the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes the COVID-19 disease. We've seen that, we all know about it, we've seen it in media and everywhere. The important thing about it is this spike protein. If you see my cursor, it's this is the spike protein, which is the way the virus attaches itself to the human cells and gain entrance to our body through this spike protein. So naturally, most vaccines or all vaccines now target this spike protein. This is just by way of background so that we know. If I can take you back for just a little bit to talk about something very important that becomes a major element to explain some of the major questions we are getting today about the potential that the vaccines we have, particularly the mRNA, people believe, or some people have the myth that it actually may alter our DNA. Just to let you know, the way the biology of our body works is the DNA, which is the building blocks of our genes, this DNA, is contained within the nucleus of the cells, the small organelle inside the cells are called the nucleus. It actually goes one way, unidirectionally. You can see this big red arrow, what we call transcription into an RNA, messenger RNA, mRNA. And the RNA unidirectional produces proteins, okay? So this is how our body works regardless of anything else. There is no way that the protein can make RNA on its own. There is no way that the RNA can enter into the nucleus or alter our genes, simply cannot get access to the nucleus. I just want to make that very clear, and we'd be happy to talk about it a bit further if there are questions related to that. Okay, you may recall that we talked about it in the last two forums, how the antibody, the body develops immunity against the virus. When we give vaccines, or if you get infected with the COVID and survive it, what happens is the body produces neutralizing antibodies. These are the Y-shaped cartoons here. And these antibodies attach itself to the spike protein and therefore prevent the spike protein from gaining access to the receptor in the human cells, what we call the ACE2 receptor. Once that happens, the antibody blocks that. The virus then does not have a way to replicate itself, and it dies or goes away. That's an important fact that we will talk about later on in answering some of your questions. So now that we've had the vaccine for almost a year, and next month and a half or so would be a year since the first license, emergency license of the vaccine. So just as Dr. Ashamallah said, we're now close to 7 billion doses injected to date in a 1 year. This is unprecedented worldwide, with very few serious adverse events. It is one of the safest vaccines we know because of a very short period of time we've been able to immunize. Over 3 billion people worldwide have gotten the vaccine, and very few serious adverse events. We obviously hear of every one of those adverse events because we're monitoring, but remarkably, there are very few relative to the number of doses administered. So, having said that, there are some incidents of some adverse events. The ones that are clear and we know about and read about frequently is the incidence of blood clot after the AstraZeneca or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. However, it's less than 1 in 100,000 vaccinees. With 80% of all those who get it survive with no issue. It would be a mild case that could be treated and no sequelae beyond that. So that's an important number, keep in mind. Now, if we go to the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, the incidence of myocarditis and pericarditis is less than also 1 in 100,000, with almost all cases resolving over time. So most of these are mild, very little sequelae, and they disappear on their own, but even if they need some medical attention, it resolves itself. And then we have the anaphylaxis, which we heard about once the Pfizer vaccine came on the market, and we saw a few cases of anaphylaxis, which is a reactogen, like allergy to the vaccine or some of its components. The incidence is 2 to 5 in 1 million vaccines, very, very low incidence. Now, that is on the one side. Now, compare that to what we know about the devastation of the virus itself, the COVID-19. And I'm here talking about death. I'm not talking about hospitalization or illness or staying home. I'm talking about severe effect of the disease, death. In the United States, about 2 in 1,000 individuals of the total population. Remember that we have reached an unfortunate number of 730 deaths in the United States. You consider that the United States population is 330 million or so, 730, almost close to 1 million now have died of it. A real devastation. In Canada, it's a bit less than that, but still 1 in 1,000. In Australia, it's even less than both, but again, still 1 in 10,000. Now compare these numbers with the incidence of side reactions that I talked about above here in the slide. The worst is 1 in 100,000, and it resolves on its own. Here is death, 1 in 10,000, in best case scenario in Australia. Now, So are they effective? So we get the vaccine, very few side reactions, but are they effective? Well, we all heard about the efficacy of the vaccine. You know, the mRNAs over 90%, the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson over 85%. But here's real world after, as I mentioned, 7 billion doses have been given to date. We know their vaccines are 75 to 95% effective against COVID-19. This is a fact. We know that from real world data. And as I mentioned, almost 3 billion people that have been fully vaccinated results in significantly less hospitalization, deaths, and infections. Now, one important factor to keep in mind is that almost all the cases now, 99% in the US, of COVID-19 infections, hospitalization deaths occur in unvaccinated individuals. This is a remarkable number that we should put right in front of our eyes all the time. If you are vaccinated, you are likely not to get infected, but even if you get infected, you're not going to get hospitalization or die from the COVID. If you are unvaccinated, the likelihood that you get infected and have serious sequelae is high. We need to make sure that that is front and center in everything we talk about. This is a remarkable vaccine, and in a way, one of the best vaccines we know today. Now I'm going to answer, provide some of the questions that we get and provide some answers to them. For example, I'm being asked all the time, if I'm vaccinated, do I still need to wear masks, sanitize in hand, and practice social distancing? And the answer is yes, not for you specifically because you are vaccinated, but if you encounter somebody who has the COVID virus, you may get some infection. You are not going to get disease. You're not going to be sick, but you still have the virus. So if you encounter somebody else who has not been vaccinated, their likelihood is that you may be able to transfer that virus to them, and then they may get sick. So if you want to alter the route of that disease, we need to all be vigilant and do our bit. Another question that I get frequently is, well, if I'm vaccinated, why do I need a booster shot? We've heard about booster shots. The FDA have licensed now Pfizer, the Moderna, and the Johnson & Johnson for certain populations, but nevertheless, the booster shot. Why is that? Now, we know today that after a few months, the level of what we call neutralizing antibody, remember the antibodies I showed you earlier in the cartoon, the number, the rate, the level of that neutralizing antibody wanes or decreases over a period of time. Now, we don't know what's the level of protection. We don't know if it decreases, that you still get disease, because we do have what's called memory cells, and we may still remember even if the levels are very low. But because we don't know that, we would like very much that people keep the antibody levels high enough to make sure that they don't get infected. We don't want to wait until they get infected and then think of the booster. That is the reason why. And as you all know by now, the FDA and the CDC recommends a booster to immune-compromised and the elderly. Another question we get frequently is, if I get the natural immunity after COVID-19 infection, why do I still need a vaccine? Now, just by way of background, when you get the infection, the level of protection you get is very good, and you get a much broader protection than when you get the vaccine. Because remember, the vaccine we talked about is targeted to the spike protein. But when you get the natural infection, you produce antibodies to every part of the virus, not just the spike. And therefore, you get a broader immunity than with the vaccine. Having said that, we know that the level of neutralizing antibody to the spike it wanes and is reduced over time. And again, just like we said with the vaccine and booster, because of that, we would like people who got the infection to at least get one shot of the vaccine. You don't need both, but you should get one at least. So with that, it significantly increases the antibody levels beyond the level after the infection, and then give you broader and possibly long-lasting protection. And that's all what I wanted to answer. I'm sure you have lots more questions, and I know Dr. Ashamallah has lots more questions to introduce to us. So with that, I'll stop sharing and give it back to Dr. Ashamallah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation, right on time. I would like to again introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Sharif Musad, MD and fellow American College of Physicians, professor of medicine at Lerner College of Medicine of Case Western Reserve University, and infectious disease specialist at Cleveland Clinic. Welcome, Dr. Sharif Musad. Please go ahead and share your slides. You are muted, please.
We all are when we start. You need to, again, enable me to share my screen. I'm sorry. It's okay. Okay, my privilege to be here with you today. Thank you very much, Dr. Ashamallah, for inviting me. So I'll touch on 6 specific topics quickly, and then we'll get to your questions, which are more important. So the first thing we're going to touch on today is what's the post-COVID, the long COVID symptoms, and what do we know about that, and sort of a perspective from last year to this year. We're going to talk briefly about the variants, since this started last year earlier this year seems like last year, when we started, when we did the previous webinar. So I'll touch on that. And then anything new about treatment? There is something on the horizon, but so far it's really what we had during the last webinar is probably what we have now. And then I think this might be a bit of a repetition from what Dr. Fahim said in terms of masking and why do we need to continue to do that. I'll just very briefly bring up anti-vaxxers and how we're handling them, and then what we are doing this time of the year, which is getting our flu shot and our COVID shot if we're getting a 3rd dose or a booster dose. Now, this picture was with the H1N1 pandemic, when I had to get the standard vaccine and the H1N1 vaccine. This obviously is a pretend picture, but I did get both shots at that time. So what's long COVID? Long COVID is being sick from COVID for more than 6 weeks. Now, this definition has really evolved over the last year or so, and I'm showing you here 2 reports, one from July of 2020 and one from September of 2021. These were 2 surveys that were done to check how long people have symptoms. And the one from 2020, all patients were just outpatients, so they were less severe. In 2021, they surveyed some inpatients, some people that were hospitalized. All these were adults above the age of 18. For 2020, they did not include anyone with any underlying medical conditions like diabetes or high blood pressure or heart conditions. In 2021, about half of them did. So that's a significant difference. And in 2020, the survey included 13 states in the United States. In 2021, this was a specific survey conducted in Long Beach, California. Now, for the main outcomes of both of these surveys, they're actually quite similar. So about a third in 2020 said that they did not return to their usual health. Remember, this survey was conducted about 3 weeks after the test was reported to be positive. And the same thing, a third in 2021 reported having at least one symptom persisting. This survey was conducted about 2 months after the onset of symptoms with a positive test. Now, what specifically these symptoms were that were reported in 2020, they were mainly cough, fatigue, difficulty breathing. In 2021, they were also fatigue, in 17%, but then 13% said they were still short of breath, couldn't taste, and having difficulty sleeping. The risk factors identified for having this long COVID syndrome or symptoms for 4 weeks or more were age more than 50 years for 2020. And for 2021 were ladies, people with pre-existing conditions like diabetes, high blood pressure, heart conditions, African Americans, and age more than 40. Now, how long one gets sick really depends on how bad one is sick at the onset of illness. So I actually made this graph from the data from the reference that I'm citing here. So people who were not ill, just had a test for like surveillance, they were checking someone was infected at home and they got a test. They really didn't have any symptoms, any long-term symptoms. But they didn't have symptoms at the onset, and they didn't have any long-term symptoms. Those who had mild symptoms at the onset, about 20% of these continued to have symptoms for more than 4 weeks. Those who had moderate or severe symptoms, up to 40%, continued to have some symptoms for up to 4 weeks. So the second point I was going to touch on was the variants. And there are variants come in different flavors, variants of interest, of concern, of high consequence, and they're all compared to that wild type virus that started out in December 2019. There are various variants, and I'm only listing the major ones here. Alpha, beta, gamma. Delta is the one that we're dealing with here more commonly, basically worldwide, and particularly in the United States, and mu, that's from Colombia. And the countries are listed here. In terms of contagiousness, clearly the Delta is much more contagious than the wild type virus. And in terms of severity of illness, they're probably quite similar in terms of how people get sick from getting these different variants. And in terms of vaccine effectiveness, only the beta that was reported first in South Africa is the one that had less vaccine effectiveness from that particular variant. Now, how are we doing with treatment? In terms of treatment, the progress in treatment has been slow, steady, but we do know that people who are moderately or severely ill, who need a hospitalization, get better quicker and die less with taking steroids of a variety of types like dexamethasone or methylprednisolone. Remdesivir is a specific antiviral that was originally created for Ebola a number of years ago, but that then was shelved, and it's being used obviously now widespread use for this virus, and quite effective. And then there's a variety of immunomodulatory agents. These are things that don't work on the virus, they work on our body's response to how our body responds to the virus multiplying in our body, basically things to help with inflammation, with other things that happen to us that we need to modulate to feel better and to avoid progression of the illness. And then obviously oxygen, because this virus mainly affects the lungs, mainly causes pneumonia, and our oxygen level drops, so we need oxygen supplementation. Now, in terms of mild or moderate illness, people who are at home, what do we have for them at this point? It's still symptomatic management, meaning things for fever, for headache, for fatigue, for like inhalants for people who are asthmatic, for like bronchodilators. There is a new drug on the horizon called molnupiravir. This is an oral drug, so it hopefully will come on the market in the next few months. It was studied, and the reports show about 50% reduction in hospitalization or death in people who got it compared to people who got placebo or a sugar pill. So the reduction was from 14% who were taking placebo to 70% to 7% who were taking this antiviral agent by mouth. So, you would see that this like a 50% reduction, but if you actually want to calculate the number needed to treat to benefit one person, the formula comes out as 14. So you'd have to treat 14 people for one person to to get a benefit from that antiviral agent. Now, the monoclonal antibodies, I would give them a grade B minus. Basically, they're not available in all countries. They are available in the United States and in several other countries. Who do we give them to? We give them to people who are above the age of 65. Again, diabetics, obese, heart and lung conditions, immune compromised. And the goal is to try to prevent hospitalization. That's the main goal. There are two formulations on the market in the United States. The first one is the Regeneron product, which is two different monoclonal antibodies, two-in-one product. And then the second one is sutrivimab, which came much later than the one that I'm listing here. And the first one that came on the market is no longer recommended at this point, probably because it's less effective than the second and third one listed. So these things are good to prevent hospitalization in someone who's an outpatient. If someone is hospitalized for a completely different reason, like they have a leg fracture and they come in and they do a screening test, when they're hospitalized and the test is positive, this monoclonal antibody should be given basically to prevent like prolongation of hospitalization or readmission. And then lastly, if someone who's exposed, is still uninfected, and is unlikely to get benefit from the vaccine for a variety of reasons, people who are on certain medications, particularly one called rituximab, are very less likely to get the benefit of the vaccine. These are people who can get this medicine, monoclonal antibodies, prophylactically to prevent development of illness. Now, as I said, Dr. Fahim touched on masking. I'll briefly touch on why we're doing vaccination, masking, and testing. I think about it as when I go in with a changing weather, what do? I layer my clothing so that I would know if the weather changes, what would I do? So a third dose of the vaccine is a little different from a booster dose. I realize this is a semantic. Basically, a third dose is what we give for people who are immunocompromised, because we know that 2 doses would not be enough for their primary immunization. A booster dose is what we probably would give for, like me, I took my booster dose because I completed my primary immunization about 8 months ago, and I got a booster dose because I'm continuously exposed to the virus as an infectious disease physician. Now, why are we still masking? We're masking indoors, in public, to decrease the chance of catching the virus, not getting ill because I'm vaccinated, and then spreading it unknowingly to someone who is either unvaccinated, unfortunately, or vaccinated but could still get infected. We also wear masks if we are exposed to a known person. This is the period of quarantine. If you go in public, we need to wear a mask. And in terms of testing, we have to test 3 to 5 days after a known exposure to check and see if did we catch it or not before traveling outside the United States, before returning to the United States, and then 3 to 5 days after returning to the United States. I'm pretty sure these regulations are different for a variety of countries. Now, in thinking briefly of responding to anti-vaxxers claims, I'll just throw out some claims and just briefly touch on the response. So, too quick in terms of development to trust. Again, as Dr. Fahim said, there were no shortcuts taken here to develop these vaccines. Breakthrough infections prove that the vaccine is no good and it's failure. Breakthrough infections are clearly less severe and you're clearly less likely to get an infection if you're vaccinated. You may still spread the virus to others if you have the vaccine. True, partially, but you're less likely to catch the virus. You're less likely to be sick from it, and that's why you're less likely to spread it to others. I think this was, discussed to death. It changes our genetic code. The mRNA is destroyed within hours after we take it. So that this basically cannot happen. And as Dr. Fahim nicely illustrated, we cannot go backwards from mRNA to DNA. It can cause cancer. Well, 3.6 billion doses. I guess this is wrong here. 3.6 billion people. So probably 7 billion doses, or half the world population, were vaccinated, and we haven't heard of any increase in the risk of cancers that were reported in any of these people. And we can't tell what's going to happen 10 years from now, but just like any other vaccine that we take, we do surveillance, and that's why we know if something is going to happen by surveillance. Someone says that the side effects of the vaccine are worse than COVID. I can tell you for sure that is not the case. Unfortunately, I did not have COVID, but I've seen basically hundreds of people with COVID. I've had the side effects of the vaccine, and I know for sure that the side effects are clearly less frequent and less severe than the disease itself. Now, I'm healthy. I don't need to, even if I get the virus, it's going to be a cold and I won't get very sick from it. Unfortunately, 6% of deaths occur in people who are otherwise healthy. On the other hand, this is the exact same figure that Dr. Fahim said, 99% of the current deaths occur in people who are unvaccinated. And then lastly, what do we do about the flu shot that we take every year? Can we take it simultaneously with the COVID vaccine? The answer is yes. And this is the most recent Centers for Disease Control and Prevention of the United States recommendation. Yes, this vaccine can be co-administered, COVID and flu, on the same day, preferably in two anatomical sites, so different two shoulders, two deltoids, but they're safe to be given together. Very early in around spring of 2021, there was some guidance by the CDC to separate by 14 days from the COVID vaccine to any other vaccine, basically because we didn't have any data at that time, but now we have tons of data. It's safe to do that, no increased side effects, and no effect on the immune response based on that. That's what I have, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Before I go forward, I would like just to show one slide because we are getting a person on the keep asking that really we are promoting the vaccine, and we have I'm not sure what this person thinks, if we have any. As you can see, neither of us have any disclosure to any company. This is just out of the goodness of our heart and how much we feel towards what's happening to our fellow humans. I just want to share with you a recent article by Mayo Clinic looking at long-term effects of COVID. And I don't want to bore you with the lower half of the slide. I couldn't put it in one slide, and if anyone have met anyone with COVID-19, there is a long-lasting side effects that those of us who claim that the virus is simple and mild and we are making a big deal because we want the pharmaceutical companies to benefit, please think again while you're looking at this slide. Think of those people who for the past year are still fatigued, who still having headaches that nobody knows why, who's having hair loss or hearing loss or smell loss for a year, and they are still suffering from it, even though the acute symptoms are well gone. Think of those people who continue to have respiratory symptoms and cough and dyspnea and shortness of breathing, even though they are even vaccinated now, but unfortunately the virus has long-term effects. People who have so much memory loss and they don't know why, and they are in early 40s or early 50s. And of course they are not demented, but so please, if you are thinking we are trying to, push you to take the vaccine because there is any benefit, please think again. The three of us have no disclosures to show you that we are putting any stocks in any company or we are benefiting any company. Though those are scientists who are speaking for the goodness of humanity. With that, I would like to ask some questions which came through many of our platforms. Dr. Fahim, is the Delta virus worse? And what is the presentation you have seen from it compared to the other main virus?
So just to be clear, the Delta virus is not worse in terms of symptoms. What is really remarkable about the Delta virus is that it is much more infectious. It attaches itself much more efficiently to the ACE2 receptor that we talked about, and therefore it can infect much quicker than the original Wuhan virus. So for example, incubation period of Wuhan maybe 5-6 days or so. The Delta virus maybe 3 to 4 days. It's much more efficient and therefore a lot more infectious. Many of the viewers have heard or talked about the R factor, the number of infections that you can create. The Delta virus is 2 to 3 times higher, has higher infection rate than the original Wuhan virus. But in terms of symptoms, it's not any worse than any of them. The beta virus, and one additional thing, the Delta virus is actually covered by the current vaccine. The current vaccines all are effective against the Delta virus. The only variant that was a bit tricky was the beta virus, but fortunately for humanity, this has almost disappeared from the world, including where it originally started in South Africa. So currently the vaccine covers all the current variants. That doesn't mean that we are comfortable in sitting because variants will happen. I guarantee you there will be variants of interest and variants of concerns down the line. But so far, the vaccines cover all the variants that we are concerned about and are propagating worldwide.
Thank you. Dr. Mossad, a question from Sydney, Australia. What is the most common complications of COVID-19, or how can we reduce or eliminate them?
So the most common complication, obviously, is respiratory failure, and once a person gets infected, and they can figure out whether they can be managed at home or not. If they cannot be managed at home and they come to the hospital, then the standard treatments that we talked about would be administered, including steroids, remdesivir, oxygen, immunomodulatory drugs. Now, if things progress, then they would need a higher level of support in terms of critical care and ventilator care, and these are things to try to prevent death, getting on a ventilator. Blood clots are very common in legs and the lungs, and blood thinners are routinely given in people who are hospitalized to prevent that, and obviously to treat that when they have.
Thank you. Question to you, Dr. Rafat. If they only have options of Pfizer and AstraZeneca, do you have a preference? Regular adult, not a child.
Sure, that's a very common question that we get all the time. Which vaccine is better? And this is clearly which one to take. The mRNA initially has shown that it has higher efficacy. That is true. When they first started, we knew that the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine gave, as I mentioned, above 90%, close to 95%, and the AstraZeneca was close to 80%. Having said that, real-world data coming out of the United Kingdom, actually just a few days ago, shows that actually the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer over a long term are reasonably similar, very few difference. And remarkably, the elderly benefits more from the AstraZeneca, while the younger ones benefit more from the mRNA vaccine. We don't know why that is, but overall, we see that people who are 50 and above have higher effectiveness of the vaccine, real world evidence, and the younger population have higher effectiveness from the Pfizer mRNA vaccine, again, real world data.
And
so both are good.
If I throw in here, you know, when we had this forum about a year ago, we thought we will have one dose. But I think I remember you said that there may be a chance that we will get a booster. Is that, as some people claim, this is just money in the pockets of the pharmaceutical companies, or this is in the science of vaccinology, a phenomenon that you all have predicted?
Yeah. So it's actually the latter. I mean, in all honesty, I am one of the ones very early on who thought that we will probably need a booster. We know that antibody wanes over time. That's for every vaccine. Remember the childhood vaccination, we give it a 2, 4, 6, 18 months, 4 to 6 years, and then when they are adults, we give them multiple times to boost the immunity. So this is not exactly the same case, but we know that levels of neutralizing antibodies go down. And because we don't know what's the level that's protective, and we don't know if there is memory, because everything is new. We started vaccinating only less than a year ago. So we don't know a lot, but what we know is that it goes down. And we have two options: wait until we get another wave in the vaccinated people, or give a booster and prevent that from happening until we understand it a little bit more. And therefore, we're going with the level of neutralizing antibodies rather than our knowledge of the protective level, because we still don't know that. I hope that answers the question in a roundabout way, but I'm happy to explain it better. Perfect.
Thank you. Dr. Sharif, can you give a couple of words to the moms who are breastfeeding or those who are pregnant? What do you guys do in Cleveland Clinic as far as those who are asking for the vaccine? Certain vaccine, no vaccine, any vaccine to avoid?
There is no vaccine to avoid. The vaccines that are currently available in the United States, the Pfizer, Moderna, and the Johnson & Johnson are all recommended and acceptable to be given to pregnant ladies in any trimester of pregnancy, or even in people who are thinking of getting pregnant or postpartum who are lactating. Now, the benefit is more than one-fold. So it's obviously for the mom, because the pregnancy state is an immunocompromised state. So clearly there are data showing that pregnant ladies who get COVID have worse outcomes than non-pregnant ladies. And then when you tell that to any mom, it's always a yes, give it to me, which is the vaccine can protect your newborn. And that happens, when you explain that with flu, that's what we do that with the Tdap, for the pertussis part, all these things, we are doing it not just for the mom, but also for the baby who, the newborn has basically a newborn immune system that would not respond to a COVID vaccine, get immunity from it for several months, probably for several years at this point that we know of. And that's why if the protection passes from the mom to the infant, then that would be some protection for the infant when they come out in the world, and grandpa comes and hugs them, and it could be, or uncle, and infect them.
Thank you. And Dr. Rafat, the conspiracies or myth, the vaccine will change my genetic makeup. I know you showed in one of the cartoons that the vaccine does not enter the nucleic but I would like you to really, in a layman understandable language, put this hopefully to rest. To what extent, if any, the vaccine can affect the genetic material of the person, the future fertility of the person. Thank you.
So these are two separate things. So let's take them one at a time. So to start with, whether it can alter the genetic material. And as I said emphatically, the answer is an absolute no. There is no way that we know, there is no way that we've ever found where an RNA spontaneously become a DNA. We can do it by other means, but there is no way that an RNA vaccine given can actually enter the nucleus, and therefore all the genetic material that you and I have are all included in the nucleus of the cell. If you can imagine, the cell is a big round ball and the nucleus is a very small piece in the middle of it, all of the genetic material is packed into that nucleus, and the mRNA does not, there is no way for it to get there, and therefore cannot alter the genetic material. Additional to that, the mRNA, as Dr. Mossad said very clearly, is broken down within a few hours of administration. Once it gets there, it works hard at translating into proteins and then is killed by the cell itself. So there is no way that it lingers around to do any damage of any kind. Now we get to fertility, and this is a question, and unfortunately a myth that we get all the time. It impacts the fertility of, initially it was women, and now we hear both men and women. And actually there has been studies that to actually look at that. For the male studies, there was a study to look at the sperm count and viability before and after vaccination, and the numbers are remarkably similar. In fact, if anything, it increased a little bit. I'm not saying that it actually, vaccination will promote fertility, but there is zero evidence that it actually impacts it. And for women, there was a theory that the spike protein is similar in structure to one important protein that is important for the development of placenta. That is absolutely rubbish in a way, because we have in our body things that are even more similar to that protein, and it doesn't have any autoimmunity to actually impact the fertility of women. Additionally to that, data have shown that many vaccinated, actually the number of pregnancies in those vaccinated is remarkably equivalent to the number of pregnancy in the placebo group, which is the unvaccinated. So there's no evidence by science or by real world practice that there is impact on fertility.
Thank you. Dr. Sharif, steroids, at one time was put down as something very dangerous. Then I believe there was more than one study that it can help in acute respiratory embarrassment. And to our physicians, our colleagues who are in Egypt or Ethiopia or Namibia, where facilities are not always readily available to admit patients, when do you see, or what is the magnitude of and the indications of using steroids?
So both steroids and antivirals, actually, when they were studied separately, and they were basically studied in hospitalized people, and they were trying to figure out, is it going to shorten the illness, but more importantly, is it going to be prevent going to the ICU, preventing death? These are the hard outcomes that they were trying to assess. So both of these, the steroids and the antiviral and the remdesivir, have the indication of hypoxia, low oxygen. Steroids have been around for, I don't know, 70 years, a variety of them. The one that was studied most for COVID-19 is dexamethasone, but you can figure out the equivalent of this, whether it's methylprednisolone or prednisone or prednisolone, and they're probably going to be quite similar. They are available oral, intravenous, so both of these can be used depending on how, if someone can take by mouth or not for a variety of illness severity. However, the remdesivir is only intravenous, so if it's given at home, then that's I guess it's possible to be given at home. It's quite frankly, it's a very safe drug. I've given hundreds and hundreds of patients this drug, and the safety margin is not a lot of side effects. We do monitor liver function tests and maybe some EKG changes, but for the most part, it's a very safe drug. So both of these, at least in the United States, are not administered at home. They are administered in a hospital setting. In other parts of the world, if they have to be administered at home, the steroids can be given by mouth. Remdesivir can only be given intravenously. And then the monitoring, obviously, one would require to monitor how much the oxygen is changing to figure out if the treatment is improving or not. And these are significant differences between these two.
Thank you. Dr. Rafat, I think the most common myth that's going around, and unfortunately picked up by some religious groups, which I was hoping we separate religion and science, but unfortunately some people are falling in that trap, is these vaccines are using embryonal or embryo or fetal tissues. How can we allow these companies to use fetal tissue? How can we be, as people of good ethics or morals, or for that matter, Christians, allow the use of fetal tissue? So A, is this a myth or a fact? Two, where exactly this myth originated from if it is not true?
Okay, so that's a little complicated question, and maybe the best way to do it is to talk about the facts first and then try to answer the question. So the facts are the following. Does any vaccine that we have today, licensed today, include any aborted fetal tissue or cells? And the answer is absolutely none. Having said that, there are two things that we use for fetal tissue for. Number one, for the mRNA vaccines, while they don't have any fetal tissue and not manufactured using any fetal tissue, we actually test the vaccine for quality control by using cells, immortalized fetal tissue, fetal cells, to test the effectiveness of the vaccine before we release the product to the market. Now, that's the mRNA. For the other vaccines, what we call the viral vectors, like the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson, in the production cycle, we actually do include fetal cells for the virus to grow. As we said several times, the viruses need cells to replicate. They are not like bacteria. They're not living organisms outside of the cell. So they need the cell to grow. And one of the ways we do for production is to actually get them to grow in cells that are from fetal origin, aborted fetal origin, that were prepared in the 60s and 70s, a long, long time ago. And these are the same cells. We keep propagating them, what we call immortalizing. These are the facts. So none of the vaccines, and in fact, all of the vaccines are being tested for what we call host cell DNA and host cell protein to ensure that they don't contain any material from the cells that we grew them in. That's host cell protein, host cell DNA. We have a certain very low level that we cannot allow any vaccine to go beyond in order to allow it to be used. Now, that's the fact. Now, to the religious, I'm not a religious, I can't advocate to talk on behalf of any religious person, but I want people to think, if, for example, as you know, just as an analogy, if somebody needs a liver transplant and a biker with a gang, for example, died in an accident, and you are taking their liver to transplant to somebody, I mean, isn't that the same thing? That you're not promoting the gang activities, you're just taking the liver to use it. In this case, I'm just using the fetal cell to grow the virus so that I can use it to help human beings. I just want people to understand that we are not using any fetal cells in there, but we need them in production of some of the vaccine and testing of others. I hope I didn't confuse people, but I wanted to make sure that we understand the facts.
Just to sort of put it in different words, and please correct me if I say anything or I present you in a different way or a wrong way. So none of the vaccines have fetal tissues.
Or cells.
Or cells. But while they are doing the vaccines, they grow them in embryo cells. Am I right?
Yeah, in cells that are propagated from aborted fetal cells.
Cell lines.
That's exactly a cell line.
Fetal cell line to grow the vaccine, but not a fetal tissue inside the vaccine.
Exactly. And in fact, as I'm saying, we actually, after they grow, we purify them to ensure that they don't have any remnants to the extent that we can test them from the actual cells themselves, the fetal cells that we use to grow them. Does that help clarify?
I think so, unless we get another question, but thank you.
Sure.
Dr. Sharif, question from Australia again. Why should we have the vaccine if it doesn't stop having the disease and still vaccinated people can pass it to others?
So we have the vaccine because we have a much lower chance of getting infected, clearly. So it's up to 90% effective. So that's why we get the vaccine. So we don't get infected. Now, if on the small chance we do get infected, we will be less sick, and we will be, if we're less sick, we are less likely to spread it to others. And obviously, if we are not vaccinated and we are more sick, we are more likely to spread it to others. So it's not only good for me, it's good for the people around me, and that was what was hoped for herd immunity, which unfortunately did not happen, but that was the goal, that we would protect, let's say, 70% of the population, and that would protect the other, let's say, 20 to 30% that did not get vaccinated.
Thank you. Dr. Rafat, could you tell us about the vaccine immunity wearing off after 6 months, which seems to be proven by an Israeli study searching the Jerusalem post-vaccine immunity? It seems that the vaccine immunity effectiveness wears down to 16% after 6 months. I'm not sure if it's true, but does that mean we have to be vaccinated on regular basis, like every 3 months?
So the answer is no, you don't need to be revaccinated every 3 months. We don't know how long the immunity will last after the booster. What we know is when you get the booster, the response that we receive, the neutralizing antibodies, is significantly increased, even beyond 2 to 3 to sometimes 2 to 10 times the level that we got after 2 shots. So after the booster, we don't know how long it will take, if at all you need an additional booster. We don't know that yet. Hasn't been that long to do. Having said that, the information in quality is correct that the neutralizing antibodies wane after 4 to 6 months, depending on the vaccine. But it doesn't go to I have not heard the level of 16% efficacy. The levels are still it's in the 60 to 70% effectiveness, and that's the disease. Having said that, hospitalization and death have been very rare in immunized individuals who had the full immunization, that is. So while you may get infected, it doesn't mean that you get terribly sick from that. So you may get, you may test positive, but that doesn't mean that you have serious adverse events like hospitalization or death.
Thank you. Dr. Sharif, is there a special protocol for raising the immunity or the body's immune system against COVID?
The things that you can do are the things that you can do for anything else, which is eat well, exercise, sleep well, just general health. These are the things that you can do to help your body fight a variety of infections in general, but not specifically, these would not be specifically for COVID.
Thank you. Dr. Rafat, there are a number of prominent immunologists highlighting the risk of ADE, antibody-dependent enhancement, being a risk with the current messenger RNA vaccines. What are your views on this?
So that actually was a question that we faced when we started developing the COVID vaccines, because of similarities of vaccines we've seen in the past, like respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, where we actually have seen ADEs, and we were worried about that. And all of the vaccines have gone initially, at least, to the rigors of preclinical studies to show that they don't induce ADEs. Having said that, since the introduction of vaccines and 7 billion doses later, we have not seen any significant increase of ADEs. And just for your viewers to know what ADEs are, this is antibody-dependent enhancement, which means that when you produce antibody to the actual virus, if later on you get the disease itself, you'll get a much vigorous serious illness than you would have otherwise before vaccination. That's what this is. And we have not seen that. As I'm saying, after 7 billion doses given, we have not seen that any of the vaccines enhance the disease when you get it later on. So it was a concern early on through development of the vaccines, but it's no longer something that we worry about.
Thank you. Dr. Sharif, the use of antivirals to prevent question 2.
I'm sorry,
Okay, so I was asking about the antivirals. There are several reports coming up from India and other places on the use of it either during or before COVID-19. What are your views?
So the only 2 antivirals that I know of are the remdesivir, and which is currently approved in the United States and multiple other countries, and then the molnupiravir, which is not approved, but it's close to, because it's gone through at least phase 2 studies. So the remdesivir is of no value prophylactically. Again, it's intravenously, and we don't know for how long to give it. Basically, the benefit would not outweigh the risk. So I would not recommend it prophylactically. And then the molnupiravir, we're still scratching the surface. So I would say let's hopefully get it off the market and give it to people to get something at home in addition to symptomatic treatment and prevent them from getting hospitalized before we spread it out to people to avoid getting infected.
Dr. Rafat, the safety of the vaccines are still in question. They rushed into development. And let me add a sub-question to that. And we don't know even if they know the long-term side effects.
Okay, so I'll take this opportunity to answer one of the questions that we got, and that is related to whether these vaccines, the COVID vaccines, are among the safest that we know. And the fact is they are among the safest. One needs to consider that the level of side effects that we are seeing is because we gave 7 billion doses in less than a year, We have never had that many doses given to that many people in that short a period of time. That's why we see that many side effects. But percentage-wise, it is among the safest that we know to date. Okay, so that's beside the point. Now, having said that, to go back to that these vaccines were developed very fast. And the answer that I will give you is in several things. When you develop a vaccine, you go through several phases: development, preclinical, clinical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then regulatory for licensure. When we had the pandemic, the world came together and threw a ton of money to develop vaccines rapidly. And that allows you something remarkable that we have not seen before, which is to do most of these steps, not all, but most of these steps in parallel. So we, for example, when we were doing the phase 1 studies, we were actually manufacturing at very large scale. So we erected facility, started as if we have a license when we didn't, so that we have enough vaccine. That's number one. The second most important factor is that we had a pandemic, which means that we have a lot of disease going around. When you do an efficacy study, you actually compare the vaccine versus a placebo, and you need a number of cases, a number of diseases to happen in both of those groups so that you can get the efficacy, you determine the efficacy. When you have a small number of disease, it takes you years to get that data. But when you have a lot of disease going around, it's very easy in a couple of months instead of 3 or 4 years to get it. So these are the two main elements. And then the third one is the regulatory, where everything has happened under what we call the rolling submission, where once we finish a piece of data, we give it to the FDA immediately. So by the end of it, they take only a week to give you a license. Well, in this case, an emergency license, as opposed to taking a year or two with back and forth questions, because everything was done on a rolling forecast. Because of this, there were no corners or important corners cut. The safety is the same. The number of people who have been given the vaccine in clinical studies is equivalent to the number that we usually go 50, 60,000 like we do for any other vaccine. So there were no shortcuts or serious shortcuts. I hope that lays that to rest, because I hear that all the time. It's remarkable that we got it that fast, but we didn't cut any important corner.
Okay. I want to get back to you about the safety, but let me ask Dr. Sharif first. Should I get the ivermectin to prevent or treat COVID-19?
So ivermectin, I've used ivermectin basically in this country to treat or prevent strongyloidiasis, which is a parasitic infection in transplant candidates and recipients that I see all the time. It's a very safe drug. The problem with it is that when it started out as a possible potential treatment for COVID-19, the dosage that was thought of was much higher than the dosage that is currently being used for the indications that is approved for. And then when it was subjected to studies that are appropriately like placebo-controlled and to prevent or to treat disease, it failed. So it did not work. And even though it was indiscriminately used in a variety of settings, including several countries around the world, it clearly does not work in terms of evidence-based, and I do not recommend it. Even though I said it's safe, when you give it to hundreds and thousands of people, you will get the side effects that are rare, and I don't want that to happen if we're going to give it indiscriminately like this.
Thank you. Dr. Afat, I know you probably answered this, but I would like to really read the question to really respect the language of the reader. I'll read it as is. I think the claim by Dr. Fahim that the current messenger RNA are the safest known vaccines in the world is incorrect and seems to be based more on belief than actual science. The number of adverse events recorded for COVID-19 vaccines in the last 12 months are higher than the total number of adverse events recorded for all vaccines since the 70s. Fact.
Okay, so as I mentioned, and I will clearly state it again, I said among the safest, I didn't say the safest, it's among the safest. We have very safe vaccines that's used. We have vaccines that are given to infants, so we know that they are very safe. I said among the safest, not the safest, number one. And number two, in essence, with, as I mentioned, we have actually given 7 billion doses in less than a year. As I'm saying, we have not had that number of vaccine doses given in that short period of time to that many people. And therefore, you expect the percentage, the numbers, the absolute numbers of adverse events to be high. But the percentage is what we need to know. What is the percentage of adverse events that we get per population or per 100 individuals or per million individuals and whatnot? And when you take it like this, as opposed to the absolute number, you see what I'm saying in essence. Now we can debate where these the facts that one of your viewers mentioned, but please consider that in order for us to compare apples to apples, we need to see the number of vaccine doses given in what period of time to how many people, and then compare it apples to apples. And I hope that helps the question. Having said that, I don't want to, in essence, propagate the discussion beyond it. The vaccines are safe. This is not me saying, this is the CDC saying, this is the FDA saying, this is the European Medicines Agency saying. This is all of these people all of these scientists are saying that these vaccines are safe. Whether they are safer or not is something we can debate. But the fact is, safety should not be a reason why you shouldn't take that vaccine, because they are truly safe vaccines. I hope that answers the question, and I certainly don't want to propagate it and make it about the numbers as opposed to the real issue we have today, which is really want people to know that these vaccines are safe and effective.
Thank you very much. We're getting to close, but there is a question came about the blood thinners. Is it routinely used? When do you Mossad? And obviously, again, in countries like Egypt, when sometimes admitting a patient to a hospital may not be as readily available as in New York, what do you advise a physician who is seeing a patient in her office and she's considering using it?
Well, blood thinners come in a variety of flavors, and as an infectious disease physician, I don't personally prescribe these medications, but I see them prescribed for the patients that are hospitalized. At Cleveland Clinic, I do not see any patient who is at home being managed who gets a blood thinner. That's basically because if someone's oxygen level is low enough to be hospitalized, then it becomes an indication for steroids, remdesivir, blood thinners of a variety of levels. And obviously, if they get into the intensive care unit where they are more recumbent and have higher risk of getting blood clots, a test called the D-dimer is monitored frequently, or ultrasounds to look for blood clots are done for surveillance, or a CAT scan to look for a blood clot in the lung. And then these people are targeted. My fear for blood thinners at home is the risk. I personally took aspirin for many years, and I was bleeding significantly when I brushed my teeth, and I stopped that for a variety of reasons. So, I mean, I'm thinking if someone is getting warfarin or heparin or any of the other directly acting anticoagulants, that, if God forbid that they would fall and hit their head, that the consequences would be really dire. And that's my concern about using anticoagulants at home.
Thank you very much. Is there any question that you think you may have heard from your communities and we have not covered? Dr. Rafat first.
I think you've covered everything that I could think of, and I think you've done a great job doing this. The one thing that I have seen is that people are still concerned about the vaccines and are waiting for the protein vaccines, the ones that we know about, like the Novavax vaccine, that is still have not been licensed yet, even though we have data from it for a variety of reasons. And therefore, that leads me to talk about that these vaccines have not been tested long enough. And I just want to tell your viewers that the very first clinical trial of an mRNA use in human beings was in 2006. So even though vaccines in large numbers have only been used for less than a year now, we actually have data, even though a very small number, because these are very early clinical trials, so smaller numbers, but we've had them for about, whatever it is, for close to 15 years now or so, that we've had the mRNA in human beings. And the viral vectors, many of you know that we've had an Ebola vaccine for a few years now. These are viral vectors. We've been using viral vectors for the past 15 to 20 years in clinical trials as well. So while these vaccines are new in large quantities for certain diseases, vaccines for certain diseases, in clinical trials, these have been tested for a very long time now. So we know a little bit more about them than people think we do. So I think that's an important point for your viewers to know, that we have a little bit more information than what appears that we do.
Thank you. Dr. Sharif, any final points that you think we did not cover throughout the last hour and a half?
I would just like to emphasize that if I think just generally the medical community and what it did for this pandemic, so far I think we should give ourselves a pat on the back for getting probably an A for the vaccine and maybe a B- for the treatment. And maybe somewhere between A and B for the precautions that we do with masking and hand hygiene, which continue to be recommended. So I still think that we should continue to vaccinate because once we get infected, it's a bad disease.
Dr. Shamala, maybe, I like the way you said it, Dr. Mossad. One last thing that actually just came to mind now while we're talking about it, and that's related to testing. Some people ask about what is the difference between nucleic acid tests or PCR testing and the rapid antigen test, and which one should I use? And countries sometimes require PCR and sometimes require antigen. The antigen test is a rapid test because all what we do is to actually detect remember we talked about the spike protein, that we just determine the spike protein in there. We don't do anything else. We take a sample and we see if there is spike protein. It's very sensitive, but not quite as sensitive as the PCR, because in the PCR, we actually take remnants of the virus and propagate it, make millions of it. So instead of having, let's say, 100 copies of the virus, we now make it millions and then test. And because of that, it is much, much more sensitive than the antigen test, because I actually use a lot more of it to increase the sensitivity. So when you do the antigen test, if you have high degree of infection, the antigen test is as good as the PCR because it detects the spike protein. If you have a low level infection, the antigen test may not detect it, but the PCR, because I propagate it and multiply it, it will. So if you get a positive with the antigen, it's accurate. If you get a negative, it doesn't mean that you don't have, but it means that you may have low levels, but you don't know about until you do a PCR.
Actually, that reminds me with something that's happening a lot. What about those patients who continue to be positive for many months, although their infection has abated, and it's probably viral shedding or something, but many of them may not be allowed to go to school or something like that. What is that phenomenon? And Dr. Sharif and Dr. Rafat, both of you, please respond.
If I might just say, because I see these people come back to the hospital, and viral shedding has been, for many viruses, rhinovirus, respiratory syncytial virus, influenza virus. For decades, we've been dealing with this, and it's important for infection prevention in the hospital in terms of contagiousness and things of that sort. But really detecting the nucleic acid of the virus doesn't necessarily mean that one is contagious. These tests, most of these tests that we do including for COVID, it's a qualitative test, not a quantitative test. Now we sometimes use what's called the cycle threshold to figure out is the inverse of the viral load or how much virus, but this is, somewhat inaccurate probably. So, I would say, not everyone who keeps testing positive for weeks to months is contagious, and clearly they would have no symptoms and could shed the virus. So I would not take that as an indication that we need to continue treatment. Dr. Fahim?
Yeah. So I'll answer it in two ways. Number one, I completely agree with Dr. Mossad about the fact that you may not have a full virus that can infect. You may have remnants. Remember, we talked about testing. We test for the spike protein, and I can test the spike protein even in a virus that can never infect anybody, and because it is now bits and pieces of the virus that I'm testing, not the whole variant. And therefore, I can still detect something when I test, but it doesn't mean that it's infectious. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, you may, in fact, be having a low level of viral infection in the upper respiratory tract. But because you are either protected because you had the vaccine or you had COVID, that it doesn't travel down to the lower respiratory tract, and that's where the disease becomes serious. So if it's in the upper respiratory tract, then you potentially can give it to others, but you will not get yourself infected because it's not going to make you seriously ill. So these are the two elements. It's either bits and pieces of virus that you're testing, or that it is just staying in the upper respiratory tract.
Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you, Dr. Rafat Fahim, PhD biochemistry, vaccinologist for over 35 years and major experience in research, development, quality assurance, manufacturing of several vaccines. Dr. Sharif Mossad, professor of medicine and infectious disease specialist at Cleveland Clinic. And thank you all for listening to us, and hope to stay safe. See you one day again. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.